I wanted to welcome you all here to the third lecture in our Ethics of Wealth lecture series. I'm Michael Leese. I'm a postdoctoral associate in the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship project here at UNH in the Department of Classics, Humanities, and Italian Studies. And this is our third lecture in the Ethics of Wealth lecture series. And today I'm proud to present our speaker for today, Dan Kaner, who is Associate Professor of History and Classics at the University of Connecticut. Dan Kaner did his BA at Princeton University, where he graduated magna cum laude in classics. He then did his PhD at University of California at Berkeley. And he was then hired at the University of Connecticut after that. His first book, which is called Wandering Begging Monks, Spiritual Authority and the Promotion of Monasticism in Late Antiquity, published in 2002, is a big hit in the world of late antiquity. And if you want to ask him about that afterwards, I know he'll be happy to discuss it. More recently, he wrote in 2010, History and Hagiography from the Late Antique Sinai. He has been visiting research scholar at New York University's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World and also at Hebrew University's Institute of Advanced Study. And this year coming up, he's just won a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's published widely on Christian economic behavior and wealth in late antiquity and early Byzantine Empire. And so please welcome me in extending a warm welcome to Dan Kaner.
Thank you, Mike. It works. Yes, such are my credentials, but the one which Mike left out is that he, in fact, is the first undergraduate who I taught who went on to any kind of advanced study. So he, in a way, is my walking credential, and I want to thank him very much for inviting me up here and for all of you for coming today. What I'm going to be talking about today is part of a book project that I'm writing, which is in a way a sequel to this first book now, which is a bit long in the tooth. That book, Wandering Begging Monks, was about spiritual poverty or ascetic poverty in early Christianity and the problems it caused as an ideal when monasticism was in its formative stages and started to pose a challenge, monks did, to church leaders, especially at the lower level of church leaders, in as much as monks were claiming that they deserved to be supported by their communities because of the spiritual gifts that they were providing to them. And this was a major issue in early monastic history. So that's what I wrote that book about, and the current study that stemmed out of that is really about wealth and how to accommodate wealth with people who are supposed to be committed to a completely spiritual life, and one which is divorced from pursuit of material gain and things of that sort. I'm not going to be talking completely about that, but it informs really everything that I have to say about the ethics of wealth in the early Byzantine Empire and what I'm going to be talking about in the course of the next hour. So, my contribution to this series on the ethics of wealth is on the Christian ethics that emerged in the late Roman Empire of the East from the 4th century, at about the time of Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity, to the 7th century and the Arab conquests. This is a time and place that's conveniently, if somewhat also obscurely, known as early Byzantium. It's in this time and place that Christianity not only became legalized under Constantine, but also became exclusively recognized by imperial decree in the year 380 as the sole religion of all Roman citizens in the Roman Empire. Now, I don't expect anyone here to know much about this late Roman or early Byzantine period, but it was vital for the evolution of Christian thought about wealth and about social justice. I want to begin my talk today by talking about three new circumstances that made it especially so. First of all, wealth. The late Roman Empire of the East wasn't the late Roman Empire of the West, which is best known for its barbarian invasions, social chaos, and imperial collapse. In these same years, the cultivated lands of the Eastern Mediterranean went more or less unscathed. In fact, in some places, they even became more productive and prosperous than they ever had before. And we can see this from archaeological remains around Antioch in northern Syria, the so-called dead cities east of Aleppo. And I point this out partly because these areas had 700 villages, all of which look essentially like this, a vast area, which has, in the past 4 years, been a refugee camp. Unfortunately, it's also been the center of one of the groups being targeted by the air, so we have no idea what state these places are in now. But for anyone who works in late antiquity, this area and the limestone massif, the hills north of ancient Antioch and west of Aleppo, is part of the proof of the economic growth and vitality that took place really from the 4th to the 7th century. So you have this area of great prosperity in the late Roman Empire of the East. Then farther south in the area outside of Amman and Jordan, and so-called Decapolis, also area full of new constructions and buildings and expansion during this period. And then finally, perhaps most amazingly, in the Negev Desert, east of Gaza in southern Israel, which if you go there now is one of the most barren places you could go in even the Near East. And it's there are remains all over the place for dry farming, viviculture, and olive culture. So you're talking about a place which is not only surviving through a very difficult period in the Mediterranean history, but one which is prospering in some places to a degree never before. And we can talk about why that was at some point later. But the reason I point that out is that this level of prosperity actually makes early Byzantium the first Christian society in history that we can actually describe as wealthy. There were some earlier churches that were affluent, but nothing on that was more or less a rare thing, and it was always somewhat precarious. At least by the 5th century, not only were many lay Christians quite wealthy, but so too were many of their Christian institutions and leaders. That's because from the 4th century onward, a combination of lay donations and imperial subsidies channeled much of this wealth into the hands of church leadership. Unfortunately, the material evidence for this new Christian wealth has been largely wiped off the map, but we get an idea of its scale from things found or preserved at even modest sites in what was once the Christian Near East. Here you have a mosaic from a church in Jordan, one of a number of treasure hoards that have been uncovered from northern Syria, famous icon from St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. Here, one of the few monasteries that has been completely excavated in this period. It's right outside of Jerusalem, which is an area where much of the archaeology actually for late antique East has happened. This was uncovered when one of the settlements was being built outside of Jerusalem. In any case, a good example of a moderately sized monastery, probably held about 300 people, but one which is very well preserved and would have been very expensive to found when in the 5th and 6th century. As you might imagine, this new influx of wealth was generally thought to be a good thing. But it also raised several new ethical challenges. These included not only how to make sure such wealth was fairly distributed to benefit all Christians in society as a whole, but also how to reconcile such wealth with earlier Christian traditions of holiness and leadership based on material renunciations. So wealth is the first new circumstances that made this period important for our purposes. Another circumstance was poverty. By this, I don't mean a sudden growth in actual poverty. I mean instead a growing recognition of the poor as a group of people who deserved care and justice. As a leading historian of this period, Peter Brown points out, before the 4th century, the poor, people who are poor, are hardly noticeable in our literary sources. After the 4th century, they seem to be nearly everywhere. This sudden prominence was directly linked to the emergence of church leaders into urban politics of the day. Now, for the first time, poor people had sympathetic advocates who forced elite Roman audiences to see the poor and not just ignore them. As one such priest proclaimed at church on a snowy winter Sunday in Antioch, "I rise before you today as an ambassador of another city, elected by the poor souls who you ignore as they lie crippled in your alleyways and streets. It's for them that I've come to speak in order to bend your hard-heartedness." Now, there's really no precedent for such advocacy in classical times. Of course, cities of the earlier empire are famous for supplying bread and circuses to their citizens, but these had never been made to the unconnected, anonymous poor. Early Byzantium, therefore, represents one of the earliest societies that we know of that tried to promote a universal concept of social justice. The third circumstance I want to point out wasn't poverty, but it was something rather similar. I'm referring now to the phenomenon called voluntary poverty. Besides being wealthy, this Christian society was the first that was truly complex. Not only did it have an imperial and provincial superstructure dedicated to protecting and taxing material gain, it also features a substantial religious hierarchy dedicated to acquiring and protecting spiritual gain. By this, I mean not only a growing body of church officials like bishops and clerics, but also a sizable population of monks. Christian monasticism was a late Roman invention. Monks interest me because they put Christian ideals to the test. Besides devoting themselves to asceticism and prayer, they were expected to show how all other Christian ideals could be put into practice. When it came to wealth, this meant showing not only the lowest level of material acquisition and consumption, but also the highest level of generosity. Paradoxically, that made monks particularly attractive to lay donors. In turn, this forced monks to formulate an ascetic ethics of wealth that worked in harmony with ethics formulated for more mainstream Christians. In fact, early Byzantine monastic literature provides one of our main sources for understanding how Christian ideas about wealth and social justice were supposed to be carried out. Such factors made early Byzantium important for our topic. I think it's clear we're dealing here with a world very different from any that exists today. Recently, my own way into this exotic Christian world has been guided by anthropology, especially anthropology dealing with gift giving. This started when I noticed how Christian literature of the period regularly used a number of different terms to describe religious gifts. Not just familiar ones like alms, offerings, and charity, but also others described as blessings and fruit bearings. My research has convinced me that each of these terms was deliberately used not only to identify different ideals and expectations associated with each gift, but also to indicate the resources from which each supposedly was supposed to come. Charity, for example, turns out to have been not just a gift expressing love, as it's normally considered to be today, if it's considered to be anything, but it's also one that's supposed to derive from a person's most essential resources or goods. Examples of charity include the widow and her two mites described in the Gospels. If you remember, this is actually one of the stories that are told in the three synoptic Gospels, where there are a number of people putting money into a collection box, and the widow gives two mites, or 2 coins, 2 little pieces of pennies, and Jesus explains to the people looking on that her gift meant much more than everyone else's because she was giving this is all that she had. This is an example associated with charity. Another example, another paradigm for charity which arose in this period was the willingness of a monk to jeopardize his own soul by agreeing to take on the sins of someone else, bearing the burdens, as it was called. Both of these examples, either giving the 2 mites, the last of what you had, or being willing to risk your life, because they contained an element of self-sacrifice, they were seen to correspond to the definition of charity in the Gospel of John, which was that true charity is when someone is willing to lay down their life for someone else. This emphasis on self-sacrifice not only distinguished charity from other types of Christian gifts, but it also especially associated it with monks, who, since they are theoretically had the least materially to give, most often had to give what was most dear to them, namely their souls or their lives. Speaking historically, I believe these distinctions were intended to create a spectrum of Christian gifts that could address different needs and concerns, thereby creating a nuanced approach to philanthropy that could accommodate the complexities of early Byzantine society. All of this was founded in turn on a Christian notion of philanthropic stewardship that challenged ordinary secular practices. Today I want to focus our attention on just 2 types of gifts within this spectrum, namely those called alms and those called blessings. I've chosen to focus on these because the discourse surrounding them, more than any other gifts, reflects ideals and concerns that arose in this period regarding the acquisition of material surplus and how it should be used. To introduce the questions associated with each of them, let me begin by telling 2 stories that came from monastic literature of the period. The first comes from a 6th century hagiography, that's literature describing or prescribing what it means to be holy. This is a hagiography of a Syrian monk named Barsema. The story describes an exchange between him and a Roman empress named Eudokia, which took place while both were in Jerusalem on pilgrimage. According to the story, when Eudokia heard the great Barsema was in Jerusalem too, she took the opportunity to ask him what she could do to make sure she'd be saved and not damned for her sins. And it was commonly known that Eudokia had left Constantinople for Jerusalem because she had been caught having an affair with an imperial courtier. So there's a lot of penance going on in this story, and some of it, a lot of it's about her being unsure of whether she would ever redeem herself. Well, in reply, Barsema told her that she'd be saved if she just gave alms to the poor. But this didn't convince Eudokia. She wasn't so sure Barsema was right. As the story explains, Eudokia feared that in her case almsgiving wouldn't work, since whatever she had to give as alms wouldn't have been produced by her own sweat. Instead, it would all come from the labor and exhaustion of the poor. Noting that her situation differed from that of the widow who gave her last 2 mites, as well as that of laborers who earned whatever they had to give as alms, Eudokia despaired that anything that she gave could ever really count. Nonetheless, Barsema assured her that she'd be absolved as long as she gave alms both mercifully and often. In thanks for this information, the empress offered Barsema many things, but the story says he refused them all except for a sumptuous robe that Eudokia was wearing, which he took as a blessing, as the story describes, to put on the altar of his monastery. Well, though fictitious, this story was obviously written to convey a certain ethics of wealth to its audience. Note that it casts doubt on the status of wealth derived out of the sweat of the poor, while assuring that such wealth could still be used for redemptive almsgiving. Note also how it distinguished such alms from gifts called blessings given to a holy man. I'll return to these distinctions in a moment, but let me first tell the other story. This one's about a monk named Euthemius, an abbot of a large monastery located on the road leading up to Jerusalem. One day, 400 Armenian pilgrims were seen heading for this monastery in hope of food. Knowing that they didn't have enough for themselves, let alone for so many unexpected guests, the monastery steward asked Euthemius, his abbot, what to do. Euthemius said to give whatever they had, assuring the steward that they'd all have enough in the end. And so it turned out. When the steward opened the storeroom door, he couldn't even get in. For according to the story, a divine blessing, or eulogia, had filled it up with blessings of wine and bread, from which all ate and were satisfied. The story ends with the abbot explaining to the steward that God had given their monastery a supply of blessings equal to their commitment to hospitality. And then it goes on to quote Paul's passage from 2 Corinthians 9, "He who sows in blessings, casts out on the ground, sows in blessings, will also reap in blessings." Well, this story is patently based on the gospel stories of Jesus' multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Nonetheless, like Barsema's story that I just told before it, it also was meant to communicate a certain ethics of wealth to its audience. Together, both stories show how authorities distinguished between good wealth and bad wealth in this period, associating good wealth with gifts called blessings, and bad wealth with gifts called alms. The story also shows how both gifts could be used to secure future prosperity. However, while good wealth might do so just by being given away to someone else in need, alms had to be given both mercifully and proactively. That way, Barsema's stories tells us, even wealth and sins like Eudokia's might be transformed and redeemed. Now, I know all this might sound like monastic fantasy. Nonetheless, such stories constitute our main source of information for early Byzantine teachings on wealth, or at least advanced teaching. And in fact, both stories describe solutions to concerns that had already been raised in the 4th century by more mainstream Christians about the origin and distribution of material wealth. We know that church leaders before the 4th century were already concerned about the nature and origins of whatever wealth was given to the church. 3rd century church manuals have lists of people or occupations from whom it was forbidden to take anything. Besides murderers, adulterers, pimps, prostitutes, and thieves, the manuals excluded people who altered the marketplace's weights and measures, or marketplace hucksters, usurers, and other people perceived to either cheat or persecute the poor. Now, these manuals show a Christian world that's largely limited to small shopkeepers. But note that these manuals don't censure wealth or its pursuit per se. They only censure perceived perversions of accepted practices. Now, that outlook considerably changed in the decades following Constantine's conversion. As more of the upper crust made up of landed gentry were entering into the Christian fold, ethical questions began to arise about their often prodigious amounts of surplus wealth. To my constant amazement, certain priests and bishops in the 4th century regularly raised such sensitive questions in public, sometimes doing so quite provocatively. Most provocative of all was one called John Chrysostom. As a priest in Antioch and later as a bishop of Constantinople, Chrysostom didn't just enjoy berating his audience for their luxuries and failure to give to the poor. He also raised the more sensitive question of how they had gotten so much wealth in the first place. In fact, he insisted that it must have originated from some kind of unjust act. On one occasion, he claimed that this was true of almost all the wealth in his city, noting how soldiers were plundering peasants, shopkeepers cheating their customers, and landowners exploiting the laborers who cultivated their estates, pouring out their sweat and getting back almost nothing in return. On another occasion, however, Chrysostom concentrated exclusively on landed wealth. Here he went so far to say that all of it was rooted in crime. It made no difference, he said, if one had inherited it rather than simply seized it from someone else, for either way, it must have come at some point from some act of injustice. Going back in time, he asks his audience, do you know if what you inherited, how it came to you and whether it was originally justly acquired? Of course not, he claims. Why? Because, he says, in the beginning, God didn't create one human rich and another human poor, nor did he show treasures to one and hide them from another, but he made the earth free for all to share alike. John Chrysostom liked to provoke his audiences, but these words expressed a consensus view about wealth and social justice that had been evolving over the 4th century and marks a significant departure from classical notions of justice and economics. While Greco-Roman philosophers generally hadn't viewed private property as problematic, Christian thinkers denied it was an absolute right. Instead, these thinkers advanced a theory of stewardship inspired by the book of Genesis. According to the stewardship theory, God had created all things out of his philanthropia, or love for humanity. Because God had created all things on earth, everything ultimately belonged to him. Since everything belonged to him, humans couldn't really claim it belonged only to them. But instead, each was accountable for using whatever he or she had, just as any steward was accountable for managing a Roman estate in a manner pleasing to his master. And what pleased God, in this case, was for each human to take what he or she needed and to share the rest with others in need. In other words, human oikonomia had to advance God's oikonomia. Note that Christians use the same word for both stewardship and divine dispensation that we use today for economy. In addition, human philanthropy had to emulate God's philanthropy. As I said, this theory was largely inspired by the book of Genesis, which not only described God's act of creation, but also provided some positive portraits of wealthy human beings. These were the patriarchs, men like Abraham and Joseph, who were said to have shared whatever they had or controlled with others who were in need. In fact, it was in this period that a belief first arose that the pyramids at Gaza were actually those silos from which Joseph once dispensed grain to all the people who poured into Egypt looking for food during the 7 years of famine. This theory of stewardship was foundational to early Byzantine ethics of wealth and social justice. To appreciate its implications, it's important to remember some basic facts of life that would have been obvious then, but are hard to remember or even imagine today. First of all, this wasn't a capitalist or a growth economy. The late Roman economy probably derived 90% of its wealth from agriculture that was inefficiently produced by about 80% of its population. For most people, extreme scarcity was the norm, and owning land, controlling land, was a key to success. In fact, the only way to ever generate a real surplus, i.e. wealth, in this economy was to collect large tracts of land, control large amounts of cheap labor, and closely regulate the entry of everything into urban markets. Those small independent farms certainly must have existed. We certainly hear almost nothing about them. Instead, most of both the produce and means of productions were owned or controlled by a small fraction of the population, mostly made up of people connected to the imperial court, a new class of trans-provincial nouveau riche, simply known in the day as the possessors. Especially in Egypt and Syria, this period saw the proliferation of large manorial estates run by stewards and worked by tenant laborers. Besides accumulating land through inheritances or marriages or purchases, such possessors were known to take whatever tracts lay near their estates, either by simply seizing them outright, or more often by offering what would be called today predatory loans. When these loans defaulted, the lenders could seize not only the land, but its owners, turning them and their families into virtual serfs bound by law to work the land in perpetuity. So accumulating land and exploiting labor were two main roots of wealth and prosperity in early Byzantium. But another notorious way that the rich got richer in early Byzantium was to control the market by speculative hoarding. Estate owners were notorious for putting their surplus grain in silos and keeping it there locked up as long as possible, waiting for the price to rise before releasing it to the market. Of course, such hoarding was especially profitable and criticized during famines. But in fact, it was the logical extension of another practice traditionally employed during the annual harvest. We're told that it was at this time of year that landowners usually made their only visit to their rural estates, and that they did so simply to collect and seize the best part of the produce for themselves, leaving the laborers who were tied to the land to survive on the dregs. These were the common and the harsh facts of life that early Byzantine preachers were challenging with their theory of philanthropic stewardship. Of course, no matter how provocative they sometimes sounded, such preachers weren't radicals, weren't communists. None called for people to rise up or emperors to redistribute land. Even Chrysostom stopped far short of fully indicting his audience for accumulating so much land. I won't press the point any further, he assured them, asking only that they ceased from making any more unjust appropriations. As with slavery, such preachers sought to improve and not remove standard practices of the day. The real problem, they claimed, was a moral one that was rooted in a sin called pleonexia. Usually translated as greed or avarice, pleonexia literally meant in Greek the desire to acquire more, as in more than was enough. To an early Byzantine Christian, this was actually the most fundamental sin of all, inasmuch as Greek authorities at least defined sin itself as a transgression of proper boundaries. We might think of the classical notion of hubris. It's not much different. It was believed, in fact, that Adam's sin, the original sin, had little to do with sex, but much to do with the sin of pleonexia, with Adam taking more than his rightful due. So how root out this most fundamental sin? Here the Greek fathers revealed their penchant for logic, because for most of them the solution was simple: to counter pleonexia one only had to be excessive in the opposite direction, giving back much more than one had unjustly taken in the first place. According to Basil of Caesarea, redemptive almsgiving had been instituted by God specifically as a remedy for the pleonexia of the rich. Such almsgiving was exemplified in the Gospels by the figure of Zacchaeus, the tax collector from Jericho, who vowed to give back fourfold of anything he had unjustly taken, in Luke chapter 19. Theoretically, such almsgiving redeemed sinners in three precise ways. First, it won over the poor, inducing them to plead for an almsgiver rather than to condemn him on Judgment Day. Second, it diminished his condition of pleonexia by reducing his surplus to appropriate levels. And third, it was thought to force an almsgiver to experience a degree of self-sacrifice, inasmuch as it forced him to give back much more than he had originally taken. By definition, that self-sacrifice turned his alms into a gift of charity, causing him, though perhaps inadvertently, to start imitating Christ's own self-sacrificial charity for the world. Thus, almsgiving came to be a basic method of remedying sins associated with bad wealth in early Byzantium. Let me linger here for a moment, because I think that this is actually much more interesting than it might at first sound. In Judeo-Christian thought, almsgiving had always been considered to be a cleansing form of penance. As the book of Tobit in the Old Testament says, almsgiving purifies every sin. But how precisely was it thought to do that? The Greek word eleemosune, from which we get alms, literally means mercy. Thus, by definition, a gift of alms, or a gift of mercy, was thought to convey a spirit contrary to the arrogant self-regard that made someone plunder, exploit, or ignore the poor in the first place. But what might make such an arrogant person actually become merciful and compassionate instead of remaining hard-hearted and arrogant? The main way was to insist that he give alms to the poor directly himself, not through any servant, as Chrysostom says was the norm, but rather through his own hand. This meant that such a person had to condescend and make contact, at least temporarily, with a level of society he had previously abused or avoided. It was this expectation of direct contact that, at least in theory, gave early Byzantine almsgiving its redemptive and transformative force. When properly done, such giving both humbled and was supposed to change the giver. Well, so far I've focused only on bad or unjust wealth in early Byzantium. What about good wealth? Here the answers are both simpler and more complicated. Aside from Genesis, the key scriptural guide for defining good wealth in this period came from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. In this passage from the New Testament, the Apostle Paul tried to explain to the Christian community at Corinth the type of gift he wanted his emissaries to go in advance of him to collect from the Corinthians in order to support some holy people, as he called them, living in Jerusalem. Note that the first point that he makes about this gift that he's sending his emissaries to collect is that this gift, which he calls a eulogia, or a blessing, was supposed to have nothing to do with pleonexia. Here I'm following the English Standard English Revised Translation of pleonexia in this passage as meaning extortion. So to go through the passage. I thought it necessary, Paul says, to ask the brothers to prepare in advance the blessing that you've promised, so that it might be ready as a blessing and not as an extortion. The point is this: he who sows a little will also reap a little, but he who sows in blessings will also reap in blessings. Therefore, let each of you give as his heart has decided to give, not out of grief, not out of compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. God, he goes on to say, is also able to give you every grace in excess, so that by always having sufficiency in everything in every way, you may be in a state of superfluity for every good work. Now, with this almost perhaps incomprehensible jumble of words, Paul presents what's actually the first, perhaps positive analysis, at least moral analysis, of material surplus to come down from antiquity. As Paul puts it, a gift called a blessing is derived from whatever surplus resources, material surplus resources, or wealth, God has given a person. That meant that a blessing itself was something extra or supplemental, which was exactly the feature that enabled a person to give it away easily and cheerfully in a manner pleasing to God. Paul also says that giving away such gifts would make them come back to the giver in return. His line, "He who sows in blessings will also reap in blessings," you'll recall, is the one found in the Euthemius story that I quoted earlier. Well, as that story exemplifies, the Euthemius story exemplifies, this Pauline concept of a gift called a blessing came to be central to early Byzantine thinking and conceptions of good wealth. In fact, by the 6th century, the word eulogia had come to designate both the extra loaves of bread that church clerics divided up and took home from them with them at the end of a Eucharist service, communion service. Also was used to designate the supplemental loaves of bread that monasteries gave out as extra rations each week to their monks, so as to supplement what they otherwise had at daily meals. But we mainly find this term blessing being used in monastic literature or papyri records to refer to gifts of money given to clerics and monks by admiring lay people. Such gifts seem to have been the equivalent of what nonprofits now call today unrestricted gifts, meaning their recipients could use them any way that they wanted. Theoretically, this meant such blessings did not oblige recipients to give their donors anything back or serve them any way in return. Now, this idea was very important in a society based on patronage, where moral exemplars were supposed to remain unaligned with any source of power, worldly power. It was also premised on a conceit that such gifts, such blessings, could never be repaid, since they ultimately came from God rather than the human agents who gave them. It was this conceit, this idea of the divine origin of the blessing, that made such gifts theoretically pure of any compulsion or taint. To ensure that they actually were so, recipients of such gifts were expected to be prepared to pass them on to anyone who asked. That was supposed to be easy, since by definition, a blessing always came from some leftover resource. Theoretically, it was also obligatory, since such blessings were supposed to represent God's material bounties, meant not just for some few, but rather for all. Anyone who received them had to treat them with great detachment, like a good steward. In fact, it was thought that anything of dubious origin, any gift of dubious origin, could be turned into a blessing, thereby transformed, simply by giving it away, which made it pure. I know I'm explaining an early Byzantine logic that was mainly associated with monks. Of course, I don't know if anyone actually used these blessings or lived up to the saintly standards of generosity that the Euthemius story describes. I'm inclined to believe, however, that some at least tried to do so, partly because early Byzantine pilgrim narratives describe receiving gifts of food called blessings regularly from monasteries they visited, and partly because early Byzantine thought seems to have encouraged or tried to encourage such generosity by equating blessings with cheap or leftover items like small bits of bread. And actually, long before I ever got into this project, I used to visit monasteries in Greece and elsewhere, and very often I'd leave with something like a pen or a bunch of olives that I didn't really want. But they are, in a way, the perfect example of a blessing, because these tended to be very cheap things. They tend to be, nowadays Taiwanese or I guess Chinese produced, knickknacks and stuff. But you'd be given this as a gift as you went. And in any case, good example of a blessing, something cheap you can give away easily if to anyone who comes by. In any case, such gifts became a symbol of wealth that was not only good wealth, but also God-given wealth, and so wealth that was considered to be sacred wealth. In addition, the open-handed generosity associated with such gifts was clearly meant to contrast to the practices of hoarding associated with bad wealth and bad surplus in this day. Still, you might ask, aside from the way that it was handled, what actually defined good wealth or distinguished it from bad? Well, that's much harder to answer. And that's partly because most of our sources, when discussing good wealth, simply define it as wealth that was given or come from God. Nonetheless, in one sermon, John Chrysostom offers clues about specific features he thought defined such wealth. Abraham's wealth, he notes, consisted of cattle, sheep, and slaves, no silver, no gold. This meant, he said, it was strictly utilitarian. One could say it means also it was not tied up in any vain sense of value. Chrysostom then contrasts the movability of such possessions with the land and buildings that his audience possessed. Unlike their wealth, Abraham's wealth was easy to liquidate and thereby pass on and give away. Finally, and this most interesting to me, he notes that Abraham's wealth was self-generating. Aside from camels and sheep, it included male and female slaves, who, Chrysostom pointed out, provided more slaves for Abraham by reproducing themselves. In other words, the production of this wealth never necessitated the use or exploitation of outside labor. Interestingly, such utility, transferability, and self-generationability are very similar to properties associated with material blessings. Yet this description of Abraham's wealth also resembles the low-level surplus occasionally identified with more ordinary laborers who worked with their own hands. Such people are rare in early Byzantine narratives, but when they do appear, it's usually to romanticize their piety, humility, and willingness to share. One story, for example, explains how a shepherd named Eucharistus inherited all his sheep from his parents, and if God ever let him derive some income from these sheep, he always split it 3 ways: a third for his family, a third for hospitality, and a third to be given to the poor. This wealth of Eucharistus, in fact, looks a lot like Abraham's: utilitarian, non-luxurious, self-generating, its excess used for philanthropy. To put it differently, good wealth, in this view, was self-sufficient, produced nearly autonomously without cheating others or exploiting another man's labor. This, I think, tends to get at the heart of what difference between a moral valuation of wealth. That's all I have to say about early Byzantine notions of good wealth and its origins. Perhaps not surprisingly, most of the literature of this period is not about how to generate good wealth, but rather how to redeem or transform ill-gotten gains into something better. Of course, one reason for that is that Christian institutions themselves quickly became deeply embedded in the social and economic framework of the day. So let me finish by pointing out 3 ways how this affected the early Byzantine ethics of wealth. First and most obviously, churches and monasteries depended on gifts from those people most especially associated with exploiting or plundering poor people, emperors and landed aristocrats. That was especially true of monasteries. Though some monasteries generated their own income by working the land themselves, there's actually very little evidence of that in large monasteries of Syria and Palestine, from which most of our literary sources and papyri derive. Such monasteries became large landowners themselves. The ideal for them was to accept gifts of land that were known not to be connected to unjust seizures or plunders, and then to use that land to generate income in a just, righteous fashion. But since monks were rarely involved in manual labor themselves, it was almost impossible for them to acquire wealth without squeezing their laborers. One writer described Syrian monks as actually weeping while eating because they knew that they were eating the labor and sweat of the poor. It's actually an interesting motif you find only in Syriac hagiography of this 6th century. Rather than renounce their entitlement to receive wealth without doing manual work, monks instead devised ways of giving away as much as possible without disrupting the status quo. And this means the status quo within the monastery, without destabilizing the monastery. One such way, aside from conceiving and giving away extraneous leftovers as blessings, was to generate more things to give away through periodic bouts of fasting. Second point I want to make is regarding that status quo, and this time not about status quo within a monastery. By the 5th century, Christian leaders were themselves justifying and praising the socioeconomic framework of early Byzantium, arguing that its divisions between rich and poor, as between emperors and subjects, or masters and slaves, had all been divinely ordained to promote order among humanity after the fall. This outlook of theirs was a logical result of a belief in divine providence. Such Christians even came to see the late Roman system itself, the late Roman Empire itself, as a reflection of God's oikonomia, as God's dispensation. Accordingly, the Christian goal of philanthropy wasn't to change anybody's lot in life, but rather to help out every person as they were in their place. This harmonized perfectly with their theory of stewardship, as long as everyone was willing to share what he had with others according to the needs of each. Finally, regarding the needs of each, the concept of philanthropy in this period was, I think, more extraordinary than is usually appreciated. That's because they adopted the ancient Greek concept of philanthropy, and then pressed it to its farthest extent. Let me explain. Literally, the Greek word philanthropia doesn't just means love of humanity. Yet, in fact, it's rarely just meant. It's rarely used just to mean showing kindness to other people. Instead, it's used to mean showing kindness to other people despite the fact that they didn't seem to deserve it. That's a very important point. This explains why the Greek word was regularly used to translate the Latin concept of clementia, clemency. It was precisely this notion of philanthropy as clemency that became pronounced in Christian literature, where God is said to have revealed his own philanthropia, love of humanity, by showing mercy, eleemosune, to human beings, despite the fact that they kept sinning and blaspheming against him. Thus, Christian philanthropy was considered to be a real moral challenge. In Greco-Roman society, that challenge, philanthropy, associated with philanthropy, tended to be limited more or less to relations between upper and lower class members of a city. But because Christianity espoused a universal agenda aimed at all humanity, the challenge now was extended to anonymous sick and poor people who had never been considered before. So such was the provocative challenge. How, you might ask, was it met? Well, it was met by recognizing a distinct set of priorities. How were these priorities determined? Well, certainly not just through economic need. Instead, in this society, as in any aristocratic society, the need to avoid or reduce shame was considered to be among the very top priorities. For this reason, when philanthropy is used in most 4th century sources, especially Chrysostom, it's usually directed at people you might not otherwise expect. Above all, rich people who had, for some reason, suddenly lost most of their wealth. Okay? Within the aristocratic society, such people, due to their status, were seen to deserve to get more aid, and in fact needed more aid than previously thought. And to recognize that this was not just a early Byzantine, late Roman outlook, one can think of King Lear, where, if you remember King Lear, Shakespeare has Lear being systematically stripped of his status by his 2 evil daughters. And at one point, the daughters ask him, when he's asked for his retinue to go off to to his other sister's castle, she says, "Why do you need so many people? Why do we need to supply you with so much food? Why do you need such decorative raiment on your way?" And Lear says in response, "Reason not the need." And that notion that you do not reason the need when it's part of a person's identity is particularly strong in this Christian outlook, as it was also in the ancient Jewish outlook. Also, so that is part of the reason why the approach to philanthropy was one of setting priorities that privileged especially people who had gone down in the world in some way. It's also for that reason why it gave priorities to the sick, group we might think deserve it. It also gave priority to the voluntary poor, or monks. All such people had declined from an original status to something else. This is what differentiated them from the ordinary working poor who were born into poverty. Such people were supposed to receive something because philanthropia was supposed to extend to all people, but they were to be a third priority. It doesn't appear to me that church institutions were set up to give these people any of the church money. Lay people were supposed to deal with them to the best that they could. Okay, so you had this prioritization in philanthropy. The other point that I wanted to point out behind this graded notion was the ancient notion of equality. Okay, we tend to think that the system priorities I just described might be unfair or was unfair. But this is a modern view, largely dictated by a modern democratic outlook. Early Byzantium didn't have any democratic notion of fairness or sharing. Okay, instead, it had a concept of equality that was called either geometric equality or proportional equality. And this approach to equality understood that differences in status, or let's say achievements, had to be taken into account, or else any notion of equality was unfair. This idea of proportional or geometric equality goes back to Aristotle and became especially embedded in Roman society, where you have people like Pliny the Younger saying things that sound completely perverse to us, such as degrees of rank and status have to be taken into account, or else there's nothing as unequal as equality. This idea became also embedded in early Byzantium because it was, in fact, a aristocratic society, but it was also embedded in the Gospels themselves, especially in that line where in the book of Acts in the New Testament says that the apostles distributed what the early Christian community had according to the needs of each. That's the classic description of this geometric or proportional equality, recognizing need and defining it in a very vague sense because it depends as much on social status as economic need. Well, so I hope I've given you something to think about today about the early Byzantine ethics of wealth. Early Byzantium is a remote, but it was also a very real world. And I think with the right analogies, it might have something to say to us today, but that's something for a different discussion. So thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions for Professor Kaner. Anyone has any?
Hi. So maybe I misunderstood because I was coming in late. So it sounded like you were saying that there were some situations where they didn't want to take money from people like usurers and things like that. But then at the same time, money from dubious sources is A-okay. So I'm just kind of confused on where those
I don't
meet.
think that I've got a mic here. I don't think money from dubious source is ever okay. But the problem is, how do you know? With most people, you don't know how wealth was acquired, and that poses all sorts of ethical problems in modern nonprofits as in antiquity. But in this period, it was especially acute because monks as was with church leaders, were supposed to be highly visibly held to a higher standard. So one of the basic ways of doing that, of handling this problem, was to give whatever they received away. You have one issue here. I think one of the things which is hard for us to understand also is how prevalent gift giving of various sorts was in this period. Where just for example, if one thinks of going to a modern church service and the Eucharist itself, most people I think of that as a ceremony of receiving something. In antiquity, at least in the church, these church services were times of giving things. People brought all sorts of things into the church to be given to the church, through the church to God. So you had many questions about what to do with these things that were being brought in. And one of them, again, was if there were doubts, to distribute them.
Yeah, I found your explanation of the stewardship theory very interesting. How do they reconcile that with the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal? Because it seems to me that implies some sort of private property.
It's a good question. with all these things, you tend to think in terms of how the sources, the literature deal with these things, and that question doesn't arise, except for the church preachers who are addressing lay people's acquisition of property, especially of landed wealth, where it's seen as almost the typical approach to any land of any owner was essentially to seize, to steal someone else's land. Usually the argument is that you are defying God's will because you're taking something for yourself that's supposed to be, that isn't yours. And the larger principle is that everything should be shared in the first place. So there's the criticism of people for plundering, stealing, oppressing the poor. It's usually under that category that's dealt with. And the larger rationale for why they should be giving rather than taking is one of stewardship. So, yes, that's how I think it would be. Do not oppress the poor and share what you have because of stewardship.
Thank you for that great presentation. I had a question about the equivalent of nonprofits or of other intermediary organizations that provided assistance to the poor, so that was how did these organizations exist?
Yeah.
And within the church, then, was it seen as more or less worthy to give to these intermediaries versus giving directly?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there were intermediaries, though nothing of the corporate nature or foundation nature that we're familiar with today when we talk about philanthropy and philanthropists. Instead, what the term used were ministries or ministrations, and there were one of the interesting phenomenon you have in the 6th century, which is really the time when when all this sort of evolution of things sort of bears fruit in full diversity, is you have, besides church-connected ministries that may be often dealing with either giving handouts of food to the poor or else taking them to hospitals. These are church-organized institutional things. You have examples of lay, completely independent lay ministries, as they were called. And one reason for that independent sort of grassroots approach is that this all seems to have been among the heretics, of whom that was about at least a third or more of the population in the East. And it appears that that heretics didn't have access to the church, the imperially funded church alternatives. So that would be the main thing, these ministries.
Hi, that was fascinating, and thank you. And I'm not sure if I understood correctly, that if the ethics of wealth and the model that you gave also strikes me as a little bit of an ethics of place, but I think I might be a century off in that. How much of this would apply to cities like Damascus and Constantinople, where you had a large merchant class? Would there be different models that would be used there than they would be for the sort of newly landed gentry, of how to distribute wealth and how wealth is defined? And I just want to take you into a second question
yes,
about the audience for some of the hagiographies and texts that you're talking about, that who the audience would be for these texts.
Yes, well, the first, most of the sermons that we have from which we have to draw on are actually given in the cities, mainly Antioch, mainly Constantinople, to some degree Alexandria. And so they're addressing an audience who the target audience for these theories I've been mentioning, at least as articulated by Chrysostom, who's our most detailed source on this. So, and the fact is there that you're talking about absentee landowners. They had their big estates out in the countryside, but they themselves lived in the city. The city also had, of course, the mercantile class, and you do have them presented. I've been trying to get more research, direct my research and get more material on money changers who seem to be very prominent in narratives that we have about charity and philanthropy. About those narratives that you were also asking, what I refer to as hagiography. Unfortunately, anyone who works in this period deals with the problem of the source material. On the one hand, the 6th century is perhaps one of the best documented periods we have in Western antiquity in terms of sheer volume of literary sources. The only comparable period is the late Republican Roman period. Nonetheless, the problem is, what type of sources are they? I mean, a hell of a lot of these are just doctrinal treatises that, unless you're interested in theology, aren't of much interest or help. Likewise, you don't have much of what modern historians consider to be primary raw sources. We don't have any diaries. We have very few personal letters. We have a lot of receipts of various things in papyri from Egypt. But on the whole, those things aside, all you have are either imperial laws or a lot of these literary narratives that I referred to as hagiography. They tend to be biographies of prominent monks, living holy people, but they're highly sterilized. They are that stylized. That actually is helpful to me because what it does is you have many of the same stories being repeated with minor variations. So I can see both a standard trope or view of something, but also see around the edges some of the details give me insight into what reality is behind some of these things. But yes, we have an awful lot of hagiography, which I guess would be called saints' lives, that are a large part of my research for this project.
Thank you.
And we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I know little to nothing about this period in the church, so this may be a super basic question.
That's why I'm here.
I was just wondering, in terms of the institution of the church, had it amassed a lot of wealth? Like, was it a very wealthy institution? And then, related to that, were there lots of accusations of corruption towards the church in its use of money, just as there were several centuries later?
Sure. Well, yes to both questions. Question of wealth is always a relative term. So how do you gauge it exactly? It's clear from the Liber Pontificalis, which is a record book for the church in Rome, that Constantine initially gave an astounding amount of money, of gold and property to the church. Then it seems to have been a real kind of trough period, and then things began to accelerate in the 5th to the 6th century, when people really started to give a lot of land to the churches, and that's mainly documented in the East. But we can't ever say what percentage, let's say, of the land in the Eastern Empire became run by either monasteries or churches, except that they suddenly had an awful lot and were able to support very large numbers, thousands of monks in these monasteries. These were not small places. I showed you a picture of one that was unusually small, but typical monastery probably had 3,000 to 5,000 people. And many of them, no one worked. So they were all supported by donations or people who were working the land. So yes, wealth was a major issue. And then, sorry, the second question was?
Oh, related to corruption.
Yes, and one way we know about the wealth is because of the charges of corruption.
That's the giving away of.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, Professor Kanner will be sticking around for the reception that we have after this. So can you all please join me in thanking him for this wonderful talk and great discussion.